Hello and welcome to another Q&A video. So it has been very long since the previous one. Things have been a little hectic, so it's taken me a ridiculously long time to get to these. I am definitely trying to, keep in mind making sure that these are ones that I get to a lot more frequently. So I will do my best going forward. I know I've said that before. Hopefully this time things are a little bit more or less chaotic and manage to achieve that. But let's dive right on in. So one of the questions was about me adding attack and flee support to the GOAP system, and in particular with highlighting being able to trigger animations. So looking at that, I have, with the hybrid GOAP system, there is now, there with the AIs, a lot of general movement animations and things like that in there. So I have expanded that to include that as just a general thing always present. Combat behaviors, however, are a bit of a tricky area, and you'll notice actually in all of the tutorials I do, I tend to try and avoid them or will only sort of cover fairly rudimentary stuff. The reason for that is to avoid conflicts with the other work that I do, because a lot of the main work that I do is working on things like combat behaviors for AIs and dealing with areas like how they attack, how they move, coordination, stuff like that. So that's why I tend to steer away from covering those, just so that there's no real sort of overlap there between the algorithms. So that's the main reason for that. However, I do want to, with the behavior tree system, I do want to be bringing that into things like our RTS and Sims and other projects. I don't have an exact ETA on that yet because there is a couple of other additions I want to do beforehand. Now, part of that migration, I want to expand the behaviors to show triggering specific animations for them. So the interactions in particular is one where I'm looking at making that as a supported thing for it. So while I won't be able to show the exact sort of combat behaviors there, showing some elements of them, things like, okay, having the AIs be playing particular animations at particular locations, that sort of stuff I can include, some areas of cooperation between the AIs, as long as it's really not in that sort of combat scenario, then it's something that is more feasible for me being able to include in tutorials. So that is sort of part of my plan there. I am currently working on some bits for that at the moment. Now, one of the other ones was, and this is a common error that you'll run into, but getting a type or namespace not found error. So how do we actually look at tracking those down? Part of the thing is there's actually a lot of things that can cause this. There's a lot of possible causes. So it could be a missing using statement in the file. This is something where Visual Studio will attempt to automatically pick the correct using, but its sorting is sometimes off. So sometimes it'll actually, if you're writing the code, bring in the wrong one. So that's a limitation that you can run into, and it can be used to fix it. But when it pops up that list of ones, you need to make sure you're picking the correct one there. So that's one possibility, that it could be that missing. Typo is another really easy common one. Again, autocomplete can actually make this really easy to have happen. Now, these two ones in particular are most likely to occur in code that you have written yourself. A missing dependency is one that could happen in code that you're writing yourself, so it might be a package not installed. Could also happen with third-party ones as well. So that's one of the things to check there of if this is happening, in a particular package, something like that, see if there are dependency ones. That should normally get sorted for you, but if something has potentially gone wrong, then that could be a little bit out of sync. So yes, checking for those missing dependencies, looking to see what package that thing that it's mentioning is missing is actually part of. You might be working with a standalone assembly, which a lot of packages will have that. and it could be missing a reference to something else. So that's something I've had to wrangle with things like the hybrid GOAP system, where I have stuff split up into a lot of different packages there. So with that, it's very necessary for me to make sure those assemblies indicate what other things they need to be able to operate. So if you've got your code group similarly, where it's a standalone assembly, then I would be checking to make sure that the references have been added in. And you can set that up on the assembly definition that the error is coming from within. Unity version changes can also actually cause this, because although it is very infrequent, but sometimes something might get renamed or get relocated to a different namespace. The other case where this could happen is if you are loading a project from a newer Unity version in an older one. That actually can very easily cause a problem like of this. Another one was how to handle generating a large dynamic world. So we're talking sort of Minecraft style, large infinite worlds where things can change and evolve in it. So there's a lot of different aspects to this. Looking at the generation side, for a very large worlds, chunk-based generation is pretty much the standard approach that you'll always see. Has a lot of advantages in that you don't need to generate the entire world at once. You don't need to keep, all those chunks loaded at once. You can generate the chunks on the fly. You can only load in the chunks that you actually absolutely need to have. So it helps out a lot in terms of performance, both rendering and also CPU side performance there. So chunk-based generation, where you only build sort of sections of the world at a time, is really handy. Now, the challenge though is, okay, that decision is an easy one, but what happens after that is where things get a little bit more complicated. Because if we're making changes to it, we could only store the changes that we make to the chunk. So when we save out, the game, it is a case of we just save out, well, it might be some generation parameters for that chunk of what was the random seed, things like of that. But you stored that, and mostly what you're storing is the changes. So that when you re-enter that chunk or need to reload that chunk, you rerun the generation. That gets, potentially quite expensive because you're doing that generation continually. You could also, once you've generated it though, store the full chunk info. And then that way, if you're making changes, those additional changes aren't going to tend to add too much to it. Like if you're adding things into that chunk, that would expand it, but removing things would actually make it take up less space. So the storage space there is going to be more, but is also probably going to be a little less sort of variable in terms of how much it changes. But both approaches are viable. Neither approach is super straightforward. I would say with this, it's going to depend a lot on what you're actually wanting to go for with this. And I would test with your particular setup, looking at the scale and scope of changes that happen in the world to see what you actually want to do there with it, as far as, do you want to store the full chunk info, or do you want to be storing, deltas somewhere in between? There's a lot of different things that could be being done there with it. So one of the things was also related to that was indicating what our current biome is. So this again, if our biomes are essentially 2D, then what we can do is just create a very low-res texture that we query. So something like a Valheim is a good example where the biomes there it's essentially just a 2D map across the world. So you could very easily just be looking up based upon your current location, where that is in the texture. Gets more complicated if you've got a 3D environment. Because if you take something like Minecraft, you have the surface area there, but then lower down, while it doesn't really sort of do this, or at least not the last time I played it. You could have a range of different biomes there as you go deeper. The generation does change slightly, but those areas are still generally considered the same biome. But you could change that and have those be different ones. So you have, caves, you could have deep caves, things like that there. Now, if you're doing that, then what I would probably end up looking at doing is looking at something like storing this as a really, really lightweight octree. So having that stored per chunk, most likely, and it's not going to need to store a lot because even if you're using a single byte per node to represent a biome, that allows you to have 256 different biomes, which is a huge amount. It's likely you would need less than that, which means can potentially pack the data in even tighter there. But I think that would be likely what I would look at for that is just something like a very lightweight octree, and that's going to make it a lot easier. I wouldn't worry about having that be an octree where the leaf nodes get too small. I would try and actually have it that they only go as small as they need to, and you try and keep them quite large. That's going to make it a lot more efficient in terms of storage space there. Now, there are other aspects to this when we're dealing with a large dynamic world. Dynamic changes, which we already touched on a little bit in terms of modifying the chunks of how we handle that. So storing of that information is a big challenge and an area to consider early on. The other is sort of how we handle things that can grow or change when we're nowhere near it, because we want stuff to keep going in the background. We want to, if you've got crafting and you might have furnaces or things like that, you want to be able to load them up with a huge amount of stuff and then go and explore. And when you come back, you want everything to be done. So this still needs to be some things ticking away in that chunk. Plants need to grow. All of these different things still need to happen. So one of the things that you could do is that chunk, a lot of it is unloaded. So the visual mesh representation of everything, anything that is not dynamic could be fully unloaded. And what you do is you do a very thin sort of simulation. So the furnace, none of the mesh, for example, would be loaded there. None of the other logic there. All it's basically got is the core furnace logic and its inputs and outputs, and it just ticks and processes those. So it's a lot lighter weight in terms of what it's needing to do. Same for things like plants. They would have some progress indicator to control where they're at in their life cycle, and that would adjust. So thin simulation is one option. So it means the more chunks explored in the world, the more work is going to need to happen in tick. So that's something to be aware of, that we do have this escalating potential overhead. The other option is we could store when something was last ticked, and then when we go back to it, do a rapid simulation of essentially barreling through that time period to have it complete whatever it needs to. Now, the danger with that is when we load in a chunk, we'd get a spike. So likely what I would actually recommend doing is probably something that's a little bit of both. You might want to have that mix of sort of inner and outer rings, and you also might want to have it that, okay, well, if we've got spare time, then let's do a little bit of ticking of these other things and do a lot of prioritization there. So I would be for things sort of a bit out of the way but nearby, try and be doing the thin simulation approach. And when we've been able to do that, we update things like the last game time ticked, and as we get further out, we do less ones in that thin simulation and more ones in that rapid sort of simulation as needed when we get nearby. So mix of both there would be my approach, and prioritizing what things get ticked based upon where the player actually is with respect to them. I think that would work quite well for it. Spawning enemies is a bit of a similar thing. So I would be inclined to place spawners as part of the generation. They don't necessarily need to be a visible thing, but doing it as part of the generation means that it's already always there. You've got a thing that you can be referring to. You don't need to do continual terrain analysis or anything like of that. And then what I would do is if the environment changes within a certain area around that spawner, then you reevaluate it, potentially relocate it, or it might end up being a case of it's destroyed. If it's put at the top of a mountain and the player has just carved out the entire top of that mountain, then the spawner would just be able to be deleted. But if it's a case where, okay, they might have flattened out that mountaintop but kept it the same height, you might want to keep that spawner there. But potentially, if they've changed the terrain to a different, material, you might want to be using that to block out spawning. So a lot of different things that we could be doing there, depending upon our needs. But I think generally picking the locations as part of that generation. And I think in general, spawners, because they're creating something that's going to have overhead, things are moving around, stuff like of that, I would only have the ones that are active in the active chunks and only when the player is really near to them so that we're not ballooning out the number of AIs around an active. Now, what we might need to do there, if you have a case where there are entities or enemies that spawn that you want to be able to support their health and things like that being remembered, then that might be a case where you need to save out some of that information as well. So any of these sort of things where we've got dynamic stuff that's needing to be ticked, things like of that, we probably have a fairly similar system handling them, whether it is a furnace or whether it is an enemy. It just controls sort of the ticking and it allows them to potentially continue or at least have some basic logic running. Now, related one to this is how we go about structuring large projects, and in particular handling things like class interactions, dependencies. This particularly can be a problem if you're dealing with a lot of singleton objects. You get race conditions there of which thing is loaded first, and something can be dependent upon another thing, and you can get a real mess and a real pain to actually work with. So, general things that I would recommend with this is, for one thing, grouping things into logical assemblies and as part of that namespaces. Having, as soon as it's a large project, grouping things into assemblies is going to help significantly with performance when you're actually iterating. So it's not really going to make a big difference, or I think any difference actually at runtime, but certainly from an iteration point of view, grouping things into assemblies is going to mean you need to compile less code when you change something, which is always helpful. Grouping them into the namespaces just keeps things neat and tidy and organized. Making appropriate use of interfaces and inheritance can make a big, big, big difference here as well. Inheritance is going to allow you to save a lot of logic and reuse things. Interfaces are going to give you a way for decoupling different sections of your project from others. So both of those, where used appropriately, are going to be able to make life a lot easier. Doesn't mean that everything should be making use of an interface or making use of inheritance. You use those interfaces where you have cases of, there is clear communication between these different things, and I want to set the rules, the API for how those look. And same with inheritance, shouldn't be used everywhere, should be used where it fits, which is where you have similar things where there is common logic, common settings, and you want to be able to reduce that duplication and reuse that logic. So appropriate use is the key there. Now, handling our dependencies and our communications, those interactions between the classes. So I am a big fan of making use of the service locator pattern to manage those dependencies asynchronously. If you're wanting an example for that, I do have a tutorial video, and that code is included for a service locator that I use in all of my projects. So it is something where it will find things, and once it's found them, it will run a particular function. So it handles things being able to be set up asynchronously. So I'm a big fan of using that approach. So strongly recommend doing something like that. Interfaces, as I mentioned earlier, allows you to decouple your systems, and it lets you swap areas in and out easier. Can be really handy for test code as well, being able to swap that in. It's a good way of just sort of creating those clean partitions in your code base. And the other thing that I do, and this ties in a little bit with the service locator, is making a lot of use of callbacks to provide looser coupling. So I previously did used to do a lot of, I would have events and I would link the event up to the particular object to actually do the communication. I tend to do those hookups now in code where possible, using that combination of service locator and having callbacks that actually link the different things. I find that's an effective way for doing it. Blackboards also can be really handy for stuff like this. They give you a way of sharing information, and it gives you sort of a common location where you could store data for different things needing to communicate. So it means you don't necessarily need to have a function that passes a huge amount of data. You could have everything just access the same Blackboard to share large amounts of information. So common one also has been if I will revisit the RPG series. It does also get asked in terms of the other series as well. Very valid comment, because I've been very focused on doing areas like AI and that of late. So in terms of if I'm going to be revisiting these, that is absolutely the plan. That is very much the plan. I want to be revisiting the RPG, RTS, and Sim series. So all of those, I do want to revisit them. I want to first get the AI framework where it needs to be for those, because what I was finding was there was a lot of things I was wanting to add to those series, and the framework was not where I needed it to be, and I was going to end up having to be implementing stuff for all of these projects, and it was just starting to get a little bit repetitious in terms of what I was doing, and I was having to sort of cut corners on the approaches, and I was wanting to avoid that. So I'm getting that framework where it needs to be first. Then the plan is to do either a large update to each of those series or use the new setup as the base. I'll do a bit of a test, to see which is going to work most effectively. And then based upon that, that's the way that I'll go with it. I'm not sure yet what that will be. I haven't tested importing the framework into those projects and switching things over. But if I do end up doing an import and switching things over, then that is something that I would cover in a tutorial, because that's something where it is quite a big change and important to sort of cover that properly. Once I've got those things updated, then I want to go back to expanding them. I do have a long list for each of these series of areas that I want to cover and areas that I want to get to. And I'm looking forward to getting to those once I've got those better tools in place for it. Other thing, and this is a great question, was how to know if you're making the right decisions on a project, especially if you're making a decision that is potentially going to be very expensive or take a very long amount of time, which is also typically going to then be expensive as well. And these are high stakes decisions. And there's a few aspects to this. The unfortunate answer is that you can't always know for sure. That's part of what makes the things so challenging. But this is where experience comes in. But just saying, okay, experience is how you make it's more likely that you'll make the right decision. Doesn't mean it's by any means guaranteed. It just means that in theory, you're more likely to. But that's not necessarily a helpful answer, because that's not something that someone who might not have as much experience can really do anything useful with, which is fair. So to break that down, how experience helps is actually the big part of this. So it gives you more knowledge of what things could go wrong so you can plan ahead and mitigate early. So the way to work with that, if you're doing this in a newer area or not as experienced, is take the time and think about, okay, what ways could this go wrong? If it goes wrong in particular way A, B, or C, then what would I do to actually adjust for that? And also, what are the signs that it is going wrong? Now, you might not get this perfect. No one's generally going to ever get it perfect. That's the nature of it, because things go bonkers at times in a project in very unexpected ways. Especially the larger and more complex it is, the more you can get into really strange, weird issues. But taking that time to plan ahead, to think about what could go wrong, what you will look for to know if it's going wrong, and look at what you can do. That's sort of a key thing there with that. So, because experience, part of what you get from that is signs to look for that things are going wrong. So you can look for things in terms of the general problem, but you can also look for things in terms of, okay, where would I expect stuff to be at? How would I expect it to be working at this particular point in time? And get a bit of a sense of and a mapping of, okay, what signs do we look for? What are sort of metrics essentially that we can look at to know, okay, does it feel like this is heading in the right direction, or does it feel like it's heading in the wrong direction? Experience, getting things wrong leads to generally better processes, because that's usually the output from, okay, I've done a project, it hasn't gone well, or it might have gone well, and there might have just been parts of it that maybe didn't go well. But usually what comes out of that is a set of processes to follow to help you validate decisions early. So that's something to again be thinking of. And in terms of with a large thing, or something that's potentially expensive in time or just general cost, process-wise, periodically reviewing where you are at and where you are heading and what you are doing next, and checking, okay, is what we're going to do next taking us towards where we need to be? So doing regular reviews like that actually can be really helpful for spotting problems early. So that's one of the big processes I like to make sure I follow on projects there, because it's very easy if you're not doing that constant checking back to get drift essentially, and you end up implementing something and it might not be what you needed. So checking early, validating those decisions, and just routinely going back and looking, where are we at? What are we doing next? Does that take us towards covering everything that we need to do? So a big part of what you can do with this, if it's an area you're not familiar with, is talking to experienced people. Talk to experienced people, think about and consider what things could go wrong, put together those plans, and making sure you're testing early, often, and looking for cheap ways of being able to get that testing, to get data to validate the decisions. But yeah, getting things tested in front of people as early as possible. So, if you're making a game that is going to need to run on mobile, then very early on, you want to be making sure that you are testing on mobile. You obviously still be doing all of your development on PC, but you want to be testing on mobile and doing that continually. Same for if it was shipping on a console or things like of that. You make sure that you're testing on everything from as early as you possibly can. And a big part of this, and this was something I learnt from getting bitten by this on one too many projects, was just as simple as making a build. So when I say testing, I actually mean not just testing in the editor, but making a build and testing that build to make sure it works. Because there can be a lot of cases where stuff just is missing or goes wrong as soon as you're in a build, and you want to spot those things early. If you spot them, very early on the first day of working on something versus spotting them when it is an hour before you need to upload a build, have that happen, it gets a little stressful if you find that problem in that final hour, and especially if the build takes a long time to make. So test early, make builds early, talk to people, get input from them on how to approach stuff, and just really lots of regularly reviewing where you need to be and where you're at is sort of the main processes I'll make. And things still might go wrong. That can still happen. And that's where we do postmortems and we figure out updated processes and we learn from it in future so that we can avoid running into those problems again. Other thing is about integrating group behaviors with the GOAP system. So we're talking sort of squad or group level AI. Now this could be GOAP based as well, could use any behavior method. It tends to, what these do is they make higher level decisions and they enable or disable goals or actions or adjust how those ones operate on the different sort of squad members. So what this can do is, for example, if the squad AI determines that the whole group is low on health, then it could enable goals for fleeing or retreating and resting. It could take those goals and give them a boost to priority so that they are more likely to be activated. So there's a few different things there. But with this, it's kind of decentralized group behavior. There's no individual leader that is dictating the behaviors. It's a cooperative sort of effort running on the squad. And that squad AI is not something you see in the world, but it is something that is continually checking things like, okay, where are all of the members of my squad? What's their health? What, equipment, things like of that do they have? What's their general condition? And making assessments based on that. So it can be GOAP based. They often tend to be a little bit simpler in terms of behaviors, but they can have those more complex, intricate ones with GOAP there if that's appropriate. The other option is having sort of leader or subordinate variants with the actions, or at least customizations. So this sort of fits for where you have a sort of AI that's directing the other members of the group. So what we'd often do with something like this is have a bit of a shared blackboard, and that leader is pushing information into it in terms of additional priorities, things like of that. So they're using that for essentially dictating what the tactics are that the subordinates were going to follow. And so those subordinates pull information from that for making their decisions. So that's and it's a very different approach in that it's centralized rather than decentralized. But what that means is then if something happens to the leader, you could have another AI take over, or you could have it that, well, now the squad is leaderless, and you see the disruption in how effectively they operate and communicate there. You also, when they've got that shared versus local information, you could have them do some prioritizing between that. So that means you could start to get a little bit more of a personality there from the members of the squad in terms of having things like, okay, well, this one is very obedient, so they rely more heavily on the information or input from the leader, whereas one that is a little bit more disobedient might just be like, I'm just going to use my information and you'd see sort of a bit of a divergence there in terms of behaviors. So a few different approaches that you could adopt with that. Another question that came in, and this was in reference to the tutorial about showing how to do a dissolve effect in the shader graph. So question there was, okay, if you've got things like a sprite, common thing with a sprite is that you're going to be doing things like an alpha cutout. So using the alpha channel to have particular sections of it not rendered. But then if you have the dissolve effect, we get a bit of a problem, because those transparent areas that we have, it'll actually stop those, because the dissolve works by feeding an alpha that it's calculated from a noise map into the output alpha. So the transparent areas would get stomped, and that's going to create visual artifacts. It's going to be looking odd. Depending upon what color is applied in those alpha sections, you could get odd colors showing through that are unintended. It's going to look strange. So the intention that we want is that those areas that have cutouts are always cut out. The most simple way to achieve this would be if you multiply the dissolve alpha by the alpha from the texture of the particular object. That's going to make it possible to then actually have, it will still do the dissolve effect, but those areas that are cut out by the alpha threshold are actually still going to remain cut out. So you won't get those odd colors and things like that appearing. Thanks, folks. That's all in terms of the questions for this time round. As I said, I am going to be doing my best to do a much better job going forward with staying up to date with addressing these questions. Probably means that it'll be a case of what'll end up happening is doing videos that are more like cover 1 or 2 questions. So they might be more like a 5-minute video covering questions that have been asked, just to actually avoid there being a long delay. So again, I do apologize for those very long delays. But if you do have questions, then do chuck those in a comment below or via the form, which I've also linked in the description as well if you're wanting to. But until next time,